recording. Right, right. Okay, and then we will just start the class. Okay, so before we start, is there any confusion about is there any confusion about how different types of exchange rates are determined? Like, what is the difference between the three types of exchange rates that we talked about, which includes free floating, fixed, and managed exchange rate? If there's any confusion, you can ask me that first. And if there's none, then we can just proceed with the lecture. No, perfect, great, excellent, right? Okay, so students, have a look at this. Today, we'll talk about pros and cons of different types of exchange rate. And this will be a very interesting topic because we will talk about, why different countries choose to, operate with different exchange rates, pros and cons of different type of exchange rates, right? So there are three types of exchange rates that are part of our syllabus, which you are already familiar with: free floating exchange rate, fixed exchange rate, and managed exchange rate. Right? Okay, now first of all, we'll start off with the free floating one, pros and cons of different types of exchange rates. Okay, now free floating, as we already know, is any exchange rate in which the government doesn't interfere, and therefore the value of exchange rate is determined solely by the market forces of demand and supply, right? So there's no other factor, third party, including government, that is interfering with determination of exchange rates, and it's only the market force of demand supply that determine the value of an exchange rate, right? Okay, now as far as, let's first talk about the pros, right? So as far as the pros are concerned, right, what do you think would be an advantage of using free floating exchange rate? Do you have any suggestions on that? Do you have any guesses, any idea? Right, let me also write this down. Free floating exchange rate. So what are some potential benefits of using free floating exchange rate in which government doesn't interfere and it lets the exchange rate float freely, and whatever value of exchange rate is determined, they take it as given? Free floating exchange rates, right? Okay, now let me give you some examples. Think about this. So students, the biggest advantage of using free floating exchange rates is that the government doesn't, or the country doesn't need to use its foreign currency reserves. Now, here you need to listen to it very carefully because only then you'll be able to make the links. Like, free floating exchange rate doesn't require foreign currency reserves. So if you remember, we were talking about this yesterday that, in Pakistan, some time back, I'm not sure exactly what time it was, but Pakistan was running, short of foreign currency reserves. And in that situation, if Pakistan would have continued operating fixed exchange rate or managed exchange rate, then that is obviously not desirable policy. Why? Because then it means that you don't have the foreign currency reserves to pay off your international debt, right? All countries in the world, as far as my understanding of economic goes, they have some sort of international debt, including USA, right? So you don't want to, kind of waste your foreign currency reserves on exchange rate, right? So the biggest advantage is, and do let me know if this is clear. If not, I'll explain you again. So the biggest advantage is that your foreign currency reserves are not spent. Why would these reserves be spent? In case you're using fixed or managed exchange rate, then in that case, when you want to artificially increase the value of your currency, do you remember we talked about revaluation yesterday? Keep too much, exactly, right? So the use of foreign currency reserves when you're trying to maintain a stronger value. So think about this. If today Pakistan decides that Pakistan needs to bring its exchange rate higher from current $1 buying, let's say, how much rupees it buys? It buys 165 or 66 rupees or whatever it is, right? So if Pakistan today decides that no, it wants to make its exchange rate stronger than this, then what is the solution? So first of all, you would know that this strategy is known as revaluation. So it would be called Pakistan is trying to reevaluate its exchange rate, and that can happen when Pakistan sell dollars and buy rupees. So selling off those dollars is not a very sensible thing to do. Why? Because these are the same dollars that we can give back to World Bank, IMF, from whichever organizations we have taken the loan from, right? So that is the biggest advantage, that in free floating exchange rates, your foreign currency reserves are not depleted. So there's no central bank's intervention, right? No, not at all, not at all. whatever the exchange rate is, even if that becomes very strong, which means if even if the interest rate, sorry, even if the exchange rate becomes too much appreciated, or even if the exchange rate becomes too much depreciated, the government will not interfere. The government will not interfere, right? Pure free floating exchange rates, governments do not interfere at all. No usage of, no usage, or let's put it in better words, foreign currency reserves are not used, which means that these can be used for other important things, right? Are not utilized. Depleted would be a better word. You know the word depleted, right? So do you remember when we talked about resources? So we said resources that cannot be, that are non-renewable, right? So let's say not wood. Wood would not be a good example. Oil is a, non-renewable resource. So that oil reserves get depleted. So after a certain point in time, when any country has extracted, exploited all the oil from its country, then obviously there would come a time when they run out of that. So that is why, that is basically what depletion means. Foreign currency reserves are not depleted and can be used to pay off international debt, right? Pay off international debt. And if there's any confusion, let me also clarify this thing, that you can't pay your debt in your own currency, right? Do you understand this? That most of the times international debt, whatever country is taking, right, whether that be Pakistan, India, China, whoever, right, they take in dollars because the dollar is the global currency, right? And secondly, when you're taking loan in dollars, you have to return in dollars. So you can't be like, okay, if it's in rupees, we can just print more rupees and give it to whoever we have to give it to, right? So this is not how it works. When we fully use our, yes, exactly, that's correct. Now, the dream, that's absolutely correct. Very good. Okay, so that is the first and the most important benefit of our of free floating exchange rates, that your foreign currency reserves are not depleted and can be used to pay off international debt, right? Okay. Anything else coming to your mind, right? So another advantage of free floating exchange rate is that the government of the country can focus on other things, right? Or you can put it like this, that less energy is spent by the government on trying to maintain a certain value of the exchange rate, which happens if there would have been fixed or managed exchange rate, right? Central bank can focus its energy on can focus its energy on monetary policy, right? So monetary policy is another very integral part of macroeconomic policy. Like, it's very important part of any country's macroeconomic policies. You would know from your AS syllabus. You guys are in AS, sorry, right? So monetary policy, I guess we haven't discussed it yet because that is the last unit. But you must have heard the word before, right? So monetary policy is when the central bank of a country uses interest rates to maintain a certain level of economic activity and so on, right? We'll talk more about this we'll talk in detail about this in fifth unit, that is about macroeconomic policies. Yes, another very important advantage. Excellent, Abdul Rahim. Automatic stabilization, right? So automatic stabilization. Now, this is a very important, point. So I would want you to pay more attention. So think about this. Preet, do ask me if there is any question, if there's anything that's not clear, right? Do ask me there and then. Okay. Now, automatic stabilization is something that happens in free floating exchange rate. Now, what is that actually? Now, let me give you a very, detailed explanation of how this basically works. Great, perfect. Okay. Now, automatic stabilization. Think about this. First, let me write down what this word is and then explain you what we mean by this. Automatic stabilization. Version of balance of payments, right? Okay, think about it. So right now, Pakistan's exchange rate is very weak against a lot of other currencies, right? So against a lot of other currencies, Pakistan exchange rate is very weak, right? So with that happening, right, our products become more price competitive, right? So if a country has weaker exchange rate, that's not always bad, which we were also talking about in the other class as well, right? That think about this. Think about this from Americans' perspective. So they give previously, what was the previous level some time back, right? I don't know exactly what time, but some time back, Pakistan's exchange rate with dollars used to be $1 used to buy 100 rupees, but now that has dropped down to $1 buying 166 rupees, right? So with weaker exchange rate, our products have become more price competitive. Why? Because think from Americans' perspective, they give $1, they used to give $1, and they used to buy good worth 100 rupees in Pakistan, right? That's how it works, right? Excluding all the transaction cost, all the money conversion problems, forget about that, right? We don't need to worry about that. But now what happens, they give $1 and they can buy goods worth 166 rupees from Pakistan, which is obviously much more compared to what it used to be, right? So that is more beneficial for them. So the thing is that if imports are now cheaper for USA from Pakistan, imports from Pakistan is cheaper for USA. Exactly, that's absolutely correct. Now, this being said, think about this. So when you're, what I was about to say. So when your balance of payment is not performing well, right? So balance of payment is again something that we'll talk right after this, but let me give you a brief explanation of what balance of payment is. So balance of payment is an official document. It's a document that records a country's international transactions, right? All international transactions, which obviously also includes your exports and imports, right? So in fact, the most important component in balance of payments is the value of exports that you made during that time period to all the other countries in the world, and similarly the amount of imports that you made from other countries in the world, right? So balance of payment is recording all international transactions, but for our purposes, we are just interested in the exports and imports values right now, right? Okay, now automatic stabilization of balance of payment happens through free floating exchange rate, because think about this. If initially your balance of payment was not performing that well, which means it was going in deficit, deficit is simply speaking more imports and less exports. Deficit is more imports and less exports. Now what happens? Now you need to listen to this very carefully, because otherwise it can get a little confusing, right? So balance of payment records, for now, just remember that balance of payment is recording the value of your exports and the value of your imports. And deficit is when imports are greater than exports. Imports are greater. So you are importing more, goods worth more compared to the worth of goods that you're exporting, right? So that is what results in a deficit. Now, what happens? Now, listen to this very carefully. What did we discuss in the last few classes? That when you are importing something, you are technically supplying your currency. I repeat myself. So when a country is importing something, it is supplying its currency. And I'm about to show you the graph over here, right? So dollar versus dollar slash rupees. And on the x-axis, you will have quantity of rupees, right? So what actually happens is that when you import more, you're supplying your currency, right? Because you're importing more, and export is when your demand for currency increases. But since in this case, in the case of a deficit, since you are as a country importing more and exporting less, the supply of your currency will increase, which means your exchange rate will become weaker. Now, when it becomes weaker, because it's a free floating exchange rate, right? You're not artificially maintaining a value. It's free floating. It can go any direction, stronger, weaker, whatever, right? Now, with a deficit, what would that do? It will make your currency weaker. It will make your currency weaker because the supply will increase. There's a deficit, more imports, less exports. The supply of your currency will shift. To the right, and this will be the new exchange rate level, which is much lower than what it was previously, right? So this means what? Now your currency is weaker. Like I was just giving you the example of Pakistani currency. Now our products have become more price competitive for other countries. Yes or no? Is this making sense? The demand for currency falls and exports will be cheap. Exactly. And then in turn, very good, excellent. And then in turn, when our currency has become, weaker, what I was just saying, that due to weaker currency because of deficit and all that stuff, your demand for goods will increase in the longer run. Why? Because now your products are cheaper. Does it make sense? So think about this. It's just like saying, so long story short, it's just like saying that if your currency is weaker in relation to, in relation to other countries which are exporting the same thing, because that is where you come in competition with, right? So if let's say Pakistan, China, and India, and all three are, let's say, exporting a certain thing, I don't know, cotton or something, right? So then if we have the, like, if Pakistan, or let's say if India has the weakest currency, then as compared to the country that is importing, right? So which countries on the other hand, let's say USA, UK, Canada, whichever, right? So then the country with the weakest currency, weakest exchange rate would benefit, given other factors are constant, obviously, like the quality of the product and so on, the terms and conditions, like the relations between two countries and so on. Does it make sense, students? So far we have talked about three benefits of free floating exchange rates, and these are the three most important ones. Can you explain this line? Given elastic, exactly, given elastic demand for exports and imports, this will result in rise in export revenue and fall. Right. So this thing is known as Marshall-Lerner condition. I'm typing over here. So Abdul, this is known as Marshall-Lerner condition, and what it basically says, there's a condition for it. So in fact, since we are talking about this, let's talk about this. Pete, have you heard about Marshall-Lerner condition before? Have you heard about Marshall-Lerner condition before? If you have not, let me explain. Okay. Now, Marshall-Lerner condition is, okay, no problem. Let me explain you to both of you then. Okay, now, okay, Marshall-Lerner condition is another thing that is related to this. So not always, economics is interesting in the sense that sometimes it says something is true, but then it also has some conditions in which it is true, right? So yes, we did say that weaker exchange rate will result in higher higher exports, but not always. There has to be a certain, there's a certain condition that has to be true. So let me explain that. And this thing is known as Marshall-Lerner condition. So I will write down the entire statement, and then I'll also explain you that what it actually means. So Marshall-Lerner condition says that weaker exchange rate will increase your exports, right? Will improve your balance of payments if, let me write this down first. Right, so weaker exchange rate will improve what we were just talking about, will improve the country's balance of payment given balance of payment given it has more elastic demand for exports and imports, given it has more elastic demand for exports and imports. Right. Okay. Now let's have a look at this. Okay. Now the thing is, you would remember what price elasticity of demand is, right? So let me give you a quick recap of that as well. So price elasticity of demand is simply a formula that captures the percentage change in demand for a good due to percentage change in price of the good. So PED, price elasticity of demand, is a formula that captures percentage change in demand, quantity demanded of a good, divided by percentage change in price of the good, divided by percentage change in price of the good. So either the demand for the good can be more elastic or the demand for the good can be less elastic. So more elastic means what? So more elastic means that any small change in price results in more than proportionate change in demand. More elastic means, let me repeat that. More elastic demand means that a small change in price, results in more than proportionate change in demand, right? And for inelastic demand, which is basically of basic necessities like food items and so on, any change in price results in small change in demand, right? Okay. Large change in price will cause larger change in quantity, right? No. Again, you don't need to say large change in price. No. Elastic means that any change, let's say, so let's put it down like this. So let me answer this question, right? So think about this. So if you have product A and product B, right? So A is more elastic and B is less elastic, right? Let's assume that the price of both the products is increasing by 5%, right? So let's say price of both the products is increasing by 5%. So A is also getting expensive by 5%, B is also getting expensive by 5%. Since A is more elastic, if we assume A is more elastic, then there will be more change, more decrease in demand for A compared to the demand for B. right? So now let's try to think about this from actual products point of view. So let's say A is movie tickets, right? So movie tickets, think about product A as movie tickets. So if you think of 5% increase in the ticket price, right? Some people might stop going to cinema to watch a movie because obviously there are other cheaper and more convenient alternatives available, including Netflix and so on, right? Right. So 5% would be perhaps a lot for the people, and they can stop going to, or perhaps not as many people will go to watch a movie in a cinema, right? Because there are cheaper and convenient options available. But if there's 5% increase in product B, let's say, and product B is, let's say, a food item, right? So think about this. How many times would you cut on your food consumption because that product has become expensive? You can't, right? You can't. It's a basic necessity. You can't help it, right? Does it make sense? So this is the distinction between more elastic and less elastic. Now coming back to the point, is this clear? So for the same change in price, for the same change in price, more elastic की demand में ज़्यादा change आएगा और less elastic की demand में कम change आएगा. ये चीज़ है, ठीक है? For the same change in price. Okay, now moving on. We were talking about Marshall-Lerner condition. Now the Marshall-Lerner condition says that अगर अभी clear नहीं है तो please ask me. If it's clear, good. If it's not, do ask me. Right? So Marshall-Lerner condition says that weaker exchange rate will result in improvement in your balance of payments given the price elasticity of demand of your exports and imports is more elastic. Right. But is this making sense now? Inelastic, in elastic का मतलब होता है responsiveness, right? So if it's elastic, which we also define as more elastic, this means that will be more change in demand. Inelastic is opposite of that. So that means that there will be less change in demand. So what is the main variable of interest? The main variable of interest is demand. So would demand change more or would demand change less? If it changes more, it's more elastic or elastic. If it changes less, that is known as less elastic or inelastic. Okay, now moving forward, students, have a look at this. Great. So it says weaker exchange rate will improve the country's balance of payment given, now there's a condition imposed with it, right? Given it has more elastic demand for exports and imports, more elastic demand for exports and imports, right? Now, let me explain you why is that the case. Okay. More elastic products are for which we respond more. Now, listen to this very carefully. More elastic products are those for which we respond more given this change in the price, right? So if you are importing, if your country is importing oil or weapons from any other country, do you think that demand will be more elastic, less elastic? Let me repeat my question. So if a country is importing oil, like the normal petrol, petroleum, whatever you want to call it, or defense equipment from another country, right? Would you expect the demand for these products to be more elastic or less elastic in relation to something as electronics or something like consumer goods, which can be like cars or something of the sort, electronics, cars, and so on and so forth. So which of the two pair of the goods do you expect the demand to be more elastic, and which of the two do you expect to be less elastic? Yes, in this case, Preet, is this making sense? So in this case, it will be less elastic. Oil and defense. Think about this. I mean, would you stop buying oil if it's getting expensive? I mean, it can't happen, right? Because oil is needed in production of, I don't know, energy, and oil is used in transportation of cars and all that stuff, right? So this will definitely have a less elastic demand, right? Less elastic demand. So even when your currency is becoming cheaper, you will not start importing more. So let's say Pakistan imports oil from USA, right? Let's think about a simple and real life example. Just Pakistan imports oil from USA. And let's say USA currency is becoming cheaper against Pakistan. USA currency is becoming cheaper against Pakistan. So Pakistan would not start importing more oil altogether. Why would you need more oil? Where would you store it? Right? Doesn't make sense, right? Similarly, if Pakistan has a certain requirement for defense equipment, right? So if our currency, which is very unlikely, but still if our currency is becoming stronger against dollars, we will not start importing more helicopters, we will not start importing more aircrafts and so on and so forth, right? Because that is less elastic. You just import it to the extent that is needed, not more than that, right? But yes, If you think of more elastic goods like cars and electronics, so for Japan or let's say for China, right? Some of these examples might be hard for Preet to understand, but think about this. Chinese cars have started becoming much more available in Pakistan. Like you see more of these Chinese brands of cars on the roads. Why? Because Chinese currency is relatively much cheaper compared to Japanese currency for Pakistan. And similarly, if you think about any other country, right? Are you getting right? So that's why when the demand for exports and imports is more elastic, only then weaker exchange rate would help. Let me repeat that, right? So Marshall-Lerner condition basically says that when the demand for your exports and imports is more elastic, only then weaker exchange rate will help you to improve your balance of payments. This is what the bottom line is. How many of you are clear on this? How many of you are still confused? How many of you are clear? How many of you are confused? Is it making sense? Right? Clear? Preet, is this clear? Clear, very good, perfect, right? So just remember that more elastic when the demand for goods, when the demand for exports and imports is more elastic, only then weaker exchange rate will result in improvement in the balance of payments, otherwise not, right? Okay, now this being said, let's move on and continue with where we were before this, right? So far we have talked about the benefits of we have talked about the benefits of free floating exchange rates, right? So we talked about three benefits, right? First of all, no usage of foreign currency reserves, right? So foreign currency reserves, currency FCR, right? So let's write it down like this, right? So no use of foreign currency reserves, which can be used for other things like paying off your international debt and so on, right? That's the first advantage. The second advantage of free floating exchange rate is that the central bank of the country can focus more on the monetary policy, right? Can focus more on the monetary policy rather than trying to maintain a certain value of exchange rate, right? So instead of trying to, instead of worrying about the exchange rate, the central bank of a country um, can focus on the monetary policy, which is its core operation, right? And then another advantage of that was automatic stabilization. Automatic stabilization was what we were discussing, and then we came to Marshall-Lerner condition. Automatic stabilization says that when your exchange rate becomes weaker, because of poor performance on your balance of payments. So if you're not exporting enough and your imports are greater, which means there is a deficit on the balance of payment, then due to that weaker currency, right? Are you getting this entire connection? Right? So automatic stabilization said that balance of payment deficit is basically what? More imports, less exports. When that happens, the supply of your currency increases. When that happens, the supply of your currency increases, right? So supply of your currency increases and therefore your exchange rate becomes weaker. And due to that, in effect, what will that do? In future, the demand for your exports will increase and your balance of payments will automatically be stabilized, right? So this is the entire connection between this is basically what automatic stabilization means, that initially your balance of payment was in deficit, you were importing more, exporting less, then your exchange rate became weaker due to that because it was free floating, and then eventually with weaker exchange rate you will start exporting more because your products will become more competitive. There is this entire connection, right? Easy. Is everyone clear on this? If there is still any confusion, please ask me. If there's still any confusion, please ask me, right? Okay, now we'll move forward from here. Right? Okay, now let's talk about some disadvantages of free floating exchange rates. Now we are moving towards cons of free floating exchange rate. Now, what do you think are disadvantages of using free floating exchange rate? Yeah. Can anyone tell me that? Right? So we are about to discuss cons of free floating exchange rate. Okay, now the first of all would be, is hot money advantage or disadvantage? Okay, so if hot money is coming in, that's I mean, that depends, but generally it's an advantage, because if hot money, like, foreigners are investing more in your country, in your banks, in your stock exchanges, so that's an advantage because the demand for your currency will increase. Abdul Rahim, are you getting me? So when money is flowing, think about this. When investment is coming in your country, which we also discussed in the other class, right? So that means higher demand for your currency, and when that happens, your exchange rate becomes stronger. So in this case, it's good. But if that stronger exchange rate is hurting your exports, then that's obviously not a good thing, right? So I mean, that depends what the need of the hour is, right? So, but generally, we say that if investment is coming in the country, that's better, because that will make your exchange rate stronger, right? Which can be a good thing, but not always. Okay. Now, this being said, let's move on. Okay. Now, what are the cons of free floating exchange rate? Now, the first thing that you can obviously tell by now, that it creates uncertainty. Exactly. Excellent. It is unstable and uncertainty, right? Too much fluctuation in the exchange rate will make your businesses risk averse, right? They cannot clearly predict, about their finances. Why is that so? Let me explain you. Too much fluctuations in exchange rate of exchange rate will make it difficult, will make it difficult for businesses to predict their expenses, to predict their, how much would importing or exporting something cost them, right? And so on. Too much fluctuation of exchange rate will make it difficult for businesses to make decisions, right? Are you getting me? So let me give you an example. So if Pakistan's exchange rate is fluctuating a lot, right, and it's very unstable, and we don't know, let's say, in free floating, obviously that is the idea that you can't really tell where the exchange rate will stand after 2 months or after 3 months, right? And then if you're making your if you have to make a decision 2 months, 3 months down the lane, and you can't really say that how much would the exchange rate be, then you can't really decide whether it's a good decision to import from USA, or is it a good decision to import from UK, and so on. Are you getting me? So simplest example of that would be, let's say there's a business, Pakistani business, that has to import something from UK or USA, right? So these are the two possible countries from where we can import. So at the moment, let's say UK's exchange rate is much stronger against Pakistani rupees, so USA is relatively cheaper option. Okay, fair enough. But what if in 2 months down the lane, UK exchange rate, our exchange rate with UK stays stable, stays where it was previously, but our exchange rate against USA depreciates a lot. Are you getting what I'm trying to say, right? So in that case, the planning will become really difficult, right? So that's a major disadvantage of free floating exchange rate, right? Okay, so yeah, so as far as the disadvantages are concerned, so there would be only one. There can be few others, but those would be related to this main one, right? So it makes it difficult for the businesses to decide and make decisions, right? Okay. Uh, then another way, like, by the way, another one that is kind of coming that I'm thinking of is that too stronger exchange rate can even hurt your, if it's free floating, which means that you do not interfere at all. Um, uh, 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 Stronger, so let's put it down like this. Stronger exchange rates can hurt a country's exports, right? So, and I'll link this to what kind of China is stuck with. I'll tell you how, right? Stronger exchange rates can hurt, and just a second, can hurt a country's exports, right? So think about this. If a country is already doing well, now listen to this very carefully. If a country is already doing well on its balance of payments, right? So you would know that China is a major exporter in the world economy, right? So if China exports so much, there is always high demand for Chinese currency, especially if they're trading in their own currency, right? So when there is high demand for Chinese currency, yuan, their exchange rate will become very strong. Their exchange rate will appreciate a lot. Now, with that happening, the demand for their products will decrease in the future. The demand for their exports will decrease in the future. Why? Because it's now more expensive for other countries to buy Chinese goods. Yes or no? Am I right? Right? But If this would have been a managed exchange rate, or if this would have been the fixed exchange rate, then the country would have deliberately kept it weak, which USA accuses China of doing that. I don't know, right? Does it make sense? No guarantee of correction of balance of payment, as we said earlier, that there's no connection, right? Exactly. Bilkul. No. Okay, so you're saying there's no guarantee of correction of balance of payment, as I said, right? Right. Yeah, obviously there's no guarantee. That depends on Marshall Lerner condition, which means that only if your demand for exports and imports is more elastic, that is when it will improve. Easy? Is this making sense, students? Okay, so how many of you understood the last example that I said, right? So why is stronger exchange rate bad? So we did talk about this, that stronger exchange rates are not always desirable because they can make your products less competitive, right? Because those will be more expensive for the other countries, and therefore, you can lose your competitiveness. So if a country is already doing very well on its balance of payments, if a country is already doing very well on its balance of payment, which China usually does, right? So its exchange rate should have been much stronger against dollars compared to what it is right now, right? And why China would want to keep its exchange rate weaker against dollars? Because then its products will be more competitive against dollars, which means more exports in the future as well. So that is what USA accuses China every now and then in the World Trade Organization, and we don't know what WTO is. World Trade Organization is the ultimate organization institute that looks after international trade. Does it make sense? Is this simple enough? Okay, so students, what our plan is, so we just covered pros and cons of free floating exchange rate in today's class, and we also did Marshall Lerner condition, right? So either tomorrow or Sunday, but definitely on one day over the weekend, we will have a class where we will go over the questions, exchange rate questions, essay questions, and yeah, that's the plan, right? So I'll let you know well in advance. Right, yeah. So the class is about to end, so we will stop here. Breathe. Today we'll stop here for today. Tomorrow, either tomorrow or on Sunday, we will have an extra class, and I'll communicate the timings to you, right? So I'll see you over the weekend, and in during that extra class, we'll do essay questions, right? So I'll see you then. Take care and have a good night. Okay, bye. We will definitely complete that. We aren't done with the topic yet. There are the pros and cons of fixed and managed exchange rate, which we'll do. Right, I'll do that and I'll reply to it. Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone. Allah Hafiz. Take care.